It was early 1943 when a strange silhouette began appearing on the edges of Pacific airstrips. Mechanics approached it cautiously, as if studying an animal no one had seen before. A fighter with a nose so long it seemed to search the horizon on its own, wings that bent like a bird caught mid-dive, and a stance that made even veterans shake their heads. Nothing about it looked balanced. Nothing about it looked safe. Yet there it sat in the morning heat, shimmering above the tarmac, like a machine built for a war that had not yet arrived. American pilots had already given it a name, one spoken half in jest, half in warning. The Ensign Eliminator. Fresh flyers approached it with a mixture of awe and dread, knowing that the aircraft was less a trainer than a trial by fire. It was said that if a young aviator could survive his first landings with it, he could survive anything the Pacific might offer. The name carried humor, but behind the laughter stood a quiet truth. The machine demanded respect long before it proved it deserved it. Its flaws were not rumors. On carriers it bucked like a startled animal, bouncing down decks with enough force to shatter landing gear and nerves alike. The tall cockpit and the downward curving nose robbed pilots of forward visibility at the very moment they needed it most. A single misjudged descent could send the aircraft skidding into the sea or into the island structures rising just ahead. For too many rookies, their final moments came not in combat, but in the last seconds of a landing gone wrong. Across the ocean, Japanese intelligence studied the same aircraft and reached a very different conclusion. Reports filed in Tokyo dismissed it as yet another foreign indulgence, clumsy, overweight, and unsuited for the disciplined skies of the empire. Observers noted its brutal shape and declared it proof the Americans had lost their way in aircraft design. They filed it under curiosities, not threats. In their analysis, true power came from harmony and elegance, not from a machine that seemed at war with its own structure. But hidden inside that awkward frame was a secret few yet understood, a 2,000 horsepower engine whose roar would soon dominate the Pacific. The very features critics mocked were the ones that would make it extraordinary. The bent wings to clear the massive propeller, the long nose to house the engine that would outclimb nearly anything it faced. And in the months ahead, the Pacific skies would hear their loudest predator awaken. The F-4U Corsair had arrived, not graceful, not forgiving, but built to endure. What no one realized yet was that its true testing ground still waited beyond the horizon. By 1942, the Pacific sky belonged to Japan. Wherever the rising sun appeared on a tail fin, the air war tilted sharply in its favor. The Mitsubishi A6M0, light as a whisper and precise as a blade, carved its reputation from China to Guadalcanal. Allied pilots learned quickly that to meet it head-on was to meet an aircraft designed for a different philosophy of war, one built on agility, reach, and an almost ascetic devotion to weightlessness. Its long range allowed Japanese fighters to strike far beyond what American planners believed possible. Its turning radius seemed to defy physics. Dogfights often ended before they properly began, as the Zero slipped behind slower American aircraft with the ease of a predator accustomed to victory. For men flying Wildcats and Buffaloes, survival depended less on maneuvering than on luck and teamwork. The imbalance was clear. The Pacific Theater needed an aircraft that could rewrite the terms of engagement. Thousands of miles away, in the cold workshops of Connecticut, engineers felt the urgency before the public ever heard about it. Drawings were revised at midnight, calculations were scratched out and redone with the weight of a continent pressing behind them. The challenge was simple to articulate, yet nearly impossible to solve. Create a fighter fast enough to catch the Zero, strong enough to outclimb it, and armed enough to strike fear into pilots who had known nothing but advantage. At Chansworth, a small team made a decision that bordered on reckless ambition. They built their design around the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the largest, most powerful radial engine America had yet produced. It was not a conventional choice. It was a gamble on brute force. If the engine could be mastered, the aircraft would be formidable. If it could not, it would end careers and lives long before it reached the front. That power carried consequences. The engine's torque was so violent it could wrench an aircraft sideways the moment its wheels left the ground. Test pilots spoke of it with cautious admiration, as if describing a machine that required negotiation rather than control. A weapon was being forged in those workshops, immense and untested, yet no one could say whether any pilot would truly learn to command it, or whether it would remain a creature too powerful for its own time. The first true test came in the Solomon Islands, where the jungle met the sea, and the air above both had become a crucible for young Marines. In early 1943, they carried the Corsair into combat for the first time, an aircraft they were still learning, an aircraft that asked discipline before trust. The engines coughed awake on the airstrips of Guadalcanal and Munda, sending dust spiraling upward as the new fighters rolled forward toward a sky long ruled by another machine. They met the zero over Bougainville, where clouds clung to the mountains like smoke from an unseen fire. For 2 years, the Japanese fighter had been a specter that dictated the rhythm of the air war. Pilots who faced it spoke of its precision, its softness in the turn, its uncanny ability to slip behind even seasoned aviators. And now, above the dense canopy, the Corsair and the Zero crossed paths for the first time. Two philosophies of war converging in the thin air over an island many could barely find on a map. The battles that followed were not graceful. They were vertical, abrupt, and defined by physics more than instinct. The Zero tried to pull the Corsair into tight spirals, seeking the dance it had mastered since China. But the American pilots resisted the temptation. They learned to fight upward and downward, not sideways. They climbed with the full weight of the R2800 behind them, then dropped into dives so fierce that the wings quivered like a living thing straining against its own strength. In those first minutes of real combat, something unexpected happened. A Japanese ace, a pilot whose record had made him nearly untouchable, fell to a Corsair diving from the sun. The kill was not luck. It was geometry meeting horsepower, altitude meeting opportunity. And when the smoke cleared, the myth of the Zero's invincibility carried its first fracture. On that day, above Bougainville's tangled wilderness, an unfamiliar shape carved its presence into the Pacific sky. It was not elegant, and it did not pretend to be. It was loud, heavy, and unapologetically powerful. A warplane that announced its arrival not with refinement, but with force. And in the weeks ahead, its true potential would reveal itself in ways no one yet imagined. At the beginning of the Pacific War, Japanese aviation stood at a height few nations could match. Its rise had been deliberate, shaped by years of conflict in China, and guided by a belief that air power could extend the empire's reach far beyond its shores. Airfields from Formosa to Rabaul launched machines that seemed to define a new era of flight. Aircraft so refined and so disciplined in their construction that they appeared to float rather than fly. In those early months, the Japanese air arm was not simply respected, it was feared because it had earned the right to be. At the center of that ascendancy was the A6M-0, a fighter that blended grace with lethality in a way no opponent had yet solved. Pilots praised its responsiveness, its astonishing range, and its ability to turn with a softness that bordered on the surreal. To many within the service, It was not merely a machine but an ideal, the embodiment of a philosophy that saw beauty and combat not as opposites, but as extensions of the same disciplined mind. The Zero's reputation spread quickly, carried on the stories of men who had survived its presence and of those who had not. Within Japanese command circles, this success shaped a distinct view of American engineering, where Japan prized balance, weight reduction, and harmony between pilot and aircraft. The United States seemed committed to excess, thicker armor, larger engines, heavier frames. To many Japanese officers, this approach reflected a misunderstanding of air combat itself. Speed mattered, but elegance mattered more. The Western mind does not understand balance, one pilot wrote home, reflecting a belief that true mastery came from precision, not from force. The war, in their view, would prove that principle again and again. Doctrine reinforced that confidence. Japanese training emphasized the individual aviator, his instincts, his discipline, his ability to outthink and outmaneuver an opponent in 3 dimensions. Combat was taught as an art, not a contest of machinery. Pilots were expected to know their aircraft so intimately that control inputs felt like extensions of thought. Lightness was not merely a design choice, it was a moral one, a belief that a warrior should never carry more than he required. And in the first year of the war, the results appeared to validate everything. Victories accumulated with a rhythm that felt inevitable. Allied formations broke apart under coordinated Japanese attacks. Airfields fell across the Pacific like dominoes, and the Zero became a symbol of a nation ascendant. Newspapers printed its silhouette with pride. Young recruits memorized its dimensions as if studying a national treasure. Confidence grew, and with it, a subtle but enduring belief that the Empire's supremacy in the air was not simply earned, it was ordained. Yet beneath that confidence lay a quiet danger. Success has a way of solidifying assumptions, of turning doctrine into dogma and innovation into something that seems unnecessary. As the empire expanded, its leaders saw the sky as a natural dominion, secure and unquestioned. What they could not yet see was how swiftly that dominion was about to be challenged. Back in the United States, far from the humid airstrips of the Solomons, the Corsair program teetered on the edge of collapse. What had begun as an ambitious attempt to outrun the Zero had turned into a series of quiet crises, each one chipping away at the Navy's confidence. Test pilots rolled the new fighter onto wooden carrier decks with a mixture of caution and resignation, knowing that every landing was an experiment and not always a survivable one. The aircraft's promise was undeniable, but its flaws seemed even more so. Carrier trials exposed those flaws with unforgiving clarity. The Corsair's long nose, which concealed the massive R2800 engine, robbed pilots of visibility during the final seconds of approach. The very moment precision mattered most. The fierce torque pulled the aircraft sideways the instant power was applied, demanding corrections quicker than instinct could often supply. Landing gear, tall and slender to accommodate the bent wings, buckled under the heavy jolts of deck impact. Each failed attempt ended with splintered wood, twisted metal, and difficult questions. Was the machine too powerful for its own purpose? Was the design simply unsuited for the narrow world of carrier warfare? The Navy reached a conclusion that surprised few who had watched the tests. The Corsair was too dangerous to operate at sea. It would not serve on carriers, at least not in its current state. For a program intended to field the fleet's next generation of fighters, the rejection felt final. The aircraft that had been built to reclaim the sky had instead been grounded by its own uncompromising strength. Yet the story did not end there. The Marine Corps, facing a different war and different limitations, saw something the Navy could not. They needed range to reach remote outposts, speed to survive the Zero, and firepower to support infantry fighting in jungles and ridges where every foot of ground cost lives. The Corsair, with all its temperamental habits, offered exactly those qualities. If it could not land on a carrier, it could still launch from coral runways carved out of wilderness, and so the aircraft found new owners, not because it was perfected, but because it was needed. On those rough airfields, under rain that turned earth to clay and heat that warped metal, marine pilots began the slow work of taming the machine. They learned to approach landings with calculated angles, to throttle with delicacy, to fight the torque before it fought them. Training became ritual. Mistakes were costly. But with each sortie, the pilots uncovered the truth hidden beneath the aircraft's reputation. The Corsair responded with extraordinary performance when handled with mastery, and punished only those who lacked respect for its power. Over time, what the Navy had feared became the Marines' most reliable weapon. The speed that once made landings treacherous now allowed pilots to strike deep behind enemy lines. The heavy frame that seemed ill-suited for carriers absorbed damage that would have crippled lighter fighters. The engine that tried to wrench the aircraft sideways on takeoff delivered the climb rate that kept pilots alive. Slowly, the curse began to look like a blessing, though its full transformation had yet to unfold. And on the horizon, a far more daunting challenge waited, one that would test both the machine and the men who had chosen to trust it. When the first fragments of Corsair wreckage reached Japanese analysts, the reaction was immediate and confident. Engineers gathered around bent aluminum ribs and shattered landing gear, studying the unfamiliar contours of the American fighter. Their conclusions mirrored the assumptions that had guided Japan's aviation doctrine from the war's earliest days. The aircraft was too heavy, too clumsy, and wholly unsuited for the turning combat that Japanese pilots believed defined aerial mastery. What they saw in those twisted remains only confirmed their convictions. To them, this was not an evolutionary threat. It was a foreign misunderstanding made visible in metal. Pilots returning from sorties reported glimpses of a strange, gull-winged machine that dove with speed but climbed with apparent awkwardness. They spoke of the long nose that obscured its path, the broad stance that looked ungainly in the air, the noise that carried long before the fighter itself appeared. Many dismissed it as an amateur creation, an aircraft designed by men who valued size over agility and thrust over finesse. In ready rooms from Rabaul to Truk, the bent-wing bird became an easy target of quiet humor. Its silhouette, unfamiliar and abrupt, seemed to defy the elegance Japanese aviators prized. Intelligence bulletins reinforced this perception. Reports circulated through command posts describing an American fighter with poor forward visibility and a reputation for dangerous carrier landings. The memos noted its failures during trials and recorded, with a tone that bordered on amusement, that the U.S. Navy had refused to deploy it at sea. To an Air Force that measured performance through precision and self-control, such flaws signaled a deeper flaw in American thinking. Propaganda writers added their own flourish, portraying the Corsair as a cautionary tale of excess, a machine born from industrial overconfidence rather than careful design. Meanwhile, the Zero continued to be celebrated as a masterpiece of balance and efficiency. Newspaper illustrations showed it slicing through clouds with painterly grace, while broadcasts praised its record and the skill of the men who flew it. In the early war years, these beliefs had been well earned. The Zero had dominated skies from the Philippines to the Aleutians, and its victories formed the foundation of a narrative that seemed unshakable. Perfection, once believed, can become its own kind of inertia. Yet beneath the laughter lingered an unspoken truth. Japanese engineers knew the limits of their machinery far better than the public did. They understood that the Zero's brilliance came from compromises that could no longer evolve: a lightweight frame, minimal armor, and an engine whose performance had already reached its ceiling. While America pushed radial power upward with engines like the R2800, Japan struggled to produce a comparable leap. Research programs strained at the edges of their capacity, seeking horsepower increases that never fully materialized. Some engineers quietly warned Tokyo that the empire was approaching the boundary of what its aviation industry could achieve. They cautioned that without new power plants, Japan would soon face opponents capable of climbing higher, diving faster, and surviving damage the Zero could not endure. The warnings were thoughtful, measured, and rooted in physics, but they were not heeded, and as the war pressed forward, the laughter that once echoed in briefing rooms would begin to fade, replaced by a realization too late to alter the course already set. At Henderson Field, the days began before sunrise and ended long after the jungle swallowed the light. The airstrip, carved from coral, framed by palms, and constantly harassed by weather and war, became the proving ground for men who had been handed an aircraft others had already judged too dangerous. Marine squadrons lived beside their machines, sleeping in tents that shook from engine run-ups and waking to the smell of fuel drifting across the field. Here, far from the design rooms of Connecticut and the skepticism of Washington, the Corsair was forced to answer a simple question: could it be mastered, or would it master the men who flew it? Training became a ritual of exhaustion and persistence. Pilots studied not only the machine, but the land itself. They learned how the crosswinds curled around the ridge, how humidity changed lift, how the heat softened the ground in ways that robbed tires of traction. They spent hours watching senior aviators attempt landings, noting each correction of rudder, each fractional shift of throttle. The aircraft did not permit improvisation. It demanded understanding. And at Henderson, understanding was earned through repetition, measured in bruised shoulders and frayed nerves. Slowly, a new culture formed around the Corsair, one built on adaptation. Marine pilots began experimenting with takeoff runs, discovering that easing the throttle upward instead of slamming it open allowed them to counter the brutal torque before it twisted the aircraft sideways. Ground crews marked subtle reference points along the strip, giving pilots the cues they needed for smoother climbs. Even the act of taxiing was adjusted. The long nose required a zigzag pattern so that pilots could momentarily glimpse what lay ahead. Every detail, no matter how small, carried weight. Landings demanded an even greater transformation. The standard carrier approach, straight, steady, predictable, was impossible. So the Marines created their own pattern, a gentle, continuous curve that allowed the pilot to keep the runway in sight until the final seconds. It was unconventional, but it worked. With each successful touchdown, confidence grew, and with it, a deeper sense that the Corsair was not broken. It simply spoke a different language. As familiarity increased, the aircraft began revealing the qualities buried beneath its rough reputation. Pilots discovered its astonishing speed when the throttle was opened in level flight, how the propeller bit into the air with a force that startled anyone accustomed to lighter fighters. They found that the Corsair's massive engine turned vertical space into a sanctuary. In climbs, it could leave the Zero behind, pulling upward with a steadiness that belied its size. The machine that had once terrified rookies now offered them the rarest gift in aerial combat: choice. Combat doctrine shifted almost overnight. The Marines embraced a method the Germans had perfected in Europe, and the Americans began refining in the Pacific: boom and zoom. It became more than a tactic, it became a philosophy. Avoid the Zero's turning circle, avoid its graceful dance. Instead, strike from above with overwhelming speed, fire a brief and disciplined burst, and climb away before the Japanese pilot could react. Altitude became a reservoir of opportunity, and the Corsair, once criticized for its bulk, now used that bulk as momentum. In skilled hands, the aircraft behaved like a creature built for the vertical. Pilots spoke of the sensation with a quiet awe, the way the Corsair seemed to settle into its dive, the way its wings held stable at speeds that left other fighters trembling. It could descend upon an enemy with the suddenness of gravity itself, deliver its strike, and disappear into the sunlit layers above. Encounters that once ended in desperate spirals now ended quickly, decisively. A new motto emerged across Marine squadrons, a simple rule passed between tents and briefing rooms. Don't turn with him, climb above him. It captured the shift not only in tactics, but in mindset. The Marines no longer feared the Zero's elegance, they bypassed it entirely, fighting in dimensions where the Japanese fighter held no advantage. And in this transformation, the monster that had once lurked in the hangar became something else entirely. A weapon defined not by its flaws, but by the discipline it demanded. Ahead lay battles that would test that discipline again and again, revealing just how far the Corsair's mastery could carry the men who learned to trust it. By 1944, Rabaul had become the fortress at the edge of the world, a volcanic crown of gun positions, airfields, and tunnels carved into the rock by thousands of laborers. For the Japanese Empire, it was the shield that guarded the northern approaches to New Guinea and the Carolines, a stronghold believed too well defended to fall and too distant for American air power to truly threaten. Yet each morning, as the sun rose over the caldera, the dull thunder of engines signaled that the war was beginning to press against its gates. It was into this sky, thick with humidity and the distant sound of artillery, that the Corsairs of Marine and Navy squadrons swept in low across the sea. They flew in tight formations, skimming over whitecaps to evade early detection, then climbing sharply as they approached the harbor. Below them, Rabaul's anti-aircraft guns opened fire with disciplined fury. Black bursts peppered the air, each one a momentary blossom of steel designed to tear into any aircraft reckless enough to enter its range. But the Corsairs pressed forward, their gull wings cutting through smoke as though slicing through a kind of trial. From the airfields ringing the base, Japanese aces scrambled to meet the intruders. Many had fought since the first days of the war, veterans of China, of Malaya, of Guadalcanal. They carried with them the confidence born from years of mastery, convinced that the lumbering American fighters would fall as easily as the ones that came before. As they lifted into the morning sky, they believed they were rising to another familiar contest, another reminder of their long-established superiority. But the duel that awaited them was unlike any they had known. The Corsairs did not circle or engage in the horizontal spirals that once defined Pacific dogfighting. Instead, they sought the one realm where their adversaries held no advantage, the vertical. As the Zero formations ascended, the American pilots pulled back on their throttles, driving the R-2800 engines upward with a sound that reverberated across the harbor. They climbed into the sunlight until their silhouettes vanished into the glare, leaving the Japanese pilots scanning the sky below, unaware that the geometry of battle had already shifted. At the peak of their climb, the Corsairs rolled over in practiced unison. Their canopies flashed in the sun for an instant, like mirrors catching a distant flame. Then they fell, not in disorder, but in controlled descent, diving at angles the lighter Zeros could not match. Gravity and horsepower fused into a single downward strike. In the seconds that followed, the sky over Rabaul lost its stillness. Japanese pilots tried to meet the attack with instinctive turns, but those instincts had been shaped in a different war. The Corsairs were already upon them. Tracer lines stitched across the air, each burst of 50 caliber fire sending a shudder through the morning light. Some Zeros disintegrated instantly, pieces scattering across the sky like fragments of broken porcelain. Others spun downward in spirals that left smoke trailing behind them, their pilots fighting controls that had served them faithfully for years, but now could not respond fast enough. The battle lasted only minutes, though to those in the cockpit it felt both immediate and endless. When the Corsairs pulled upward to regain altitude, the sky below had changed. The Zero formations were broken. The coordinated defenses that once defined Rabaul's air presence had dissolved into scattered attempts at retreat. Even veteran aces found themselves on the defensive, forced into dives they could not sustain or climbs they could not complete. The field of advantage, once unquestionably theirs, had tilted in a single morning. Observers on nearby ships recorded the fight in terse language, noting the sudden collapse of Japanese resistance and the unexpected ferocity of the American attack. Intelligence officers studying the aftermath wrote in their reports, "Enemy morale visibly shaken." It was a rare understatement. The men who had once laughed at the bent-wing intruder now spoke of it with unease, recognizing in its silhouette the promise of a future they were no longer prepared to challenge. Above the fortress that had anchored Japan's Pacific ambitions, the duel had revealed a truth long forming in the shadows. The age of the Zero was ending, and the Corsair had arrived to claim the sky. Yet even this victory was only the beginning, for the war still demanded the Corsair prove itself on an even greater stage, one where the risks were higher and the margin for error vanished entirely. By 1944, the Corsair's reputation no longer lived in the cautious reports of test pilots or the uncertain hopes of engineers. It lived in the Pacific sky. Marine squadrons had proven what the machine could do when wrestled into submission. Dives that shattered enemy formations, climbs that broke the rhythm of Zero tactics, kills won not through elegance but through decisive power. The aircraft that once terrified its own pilots had now terrified its enemies, and with each victory, the Navy felt a quiet pressure building, a realization that the fighter they had rejected was becoming impossible to ignore. In factories and test hangars across the United States, engineers approached the Corsair again with the humility born of experience. They understood now that the machine's failures were not indictments of its potential, but symptoms of a design pushed close to the edge of what wartime aviation could achieve. So they returned to the drawing board, not to reinvent the fighter, but to refine the elements that had made it a liability at sea. New landing gear was crafted, stronger and more forgiving under pressure. A longer tail wheel was introduced, raising the nose just enough for pilots to glimpse the deck in the final seconds of descent. Even the cockpit was revised, the canopy reshaped to widen the forward field of view. Each change was deliberate, incremental, and driven by lessons paid for in broken airframes and near misses. When the updated Corsairs arrived for carrier trials, the atmosphere was one of wary anticipation. The flight deck crew remembered the old tests, the bounces, the skids, the harsh impacts that had shaken confidence up and down the chain of command. Now they watched as the new variant taxied forward, its engine rumbling with the same familiar depth, but its posture subtly altered. The first approach came cautiously, the pilot maintaining the curved pattern developed in the Solomons. As the aircraft settled onto the deck, the landing gear absorbed the impact cleanly, without the jarring recoil that had once doomed the fighter. The hook caught the wire with a smooth finality. For a moment, the deck was silent. Then the test officer nodded. More trials followed, each one reinforcing what had once seemed impossible. Landing after landing, the Corsair behaved with a steadiness that surprised even those who had championed its redesign. The long nose still required respect, the engine still demanded discipline, but the aircraft no longer fought its own pilots. The changes had not tamed the Corsair's power. They had made that power usable in the narrow, unforgiving environment of a carrier's deck. What had once been chaos now resembled control. The Navy took notice. Reports from the Pacific already showed that the fighter was outclassing Japanese aircraft in open combat, and now the final barrier, carrier suitability, had been cleared. The decision came quickly. The Corsair would be reinstated for full fleet operations. The rejection that had nearly ended the program was overturned, replaced by an urgency to deploy the aircraft wherever the fighting grew fiercest. Within months, carrier squadrons began to receive their own Corsairs, each one a testament to the pilots who had proven its worth and the engineers who had refused to surrender to its flaws. As these new machines arrived on the decks of Essex-class carriers, a quiet shift rippled through the fleet. The aircraft once derided as a nightmare had become the Navy's flagship fighter. The machine pilots requested, crews respected, and planners counted on when operations demanded reach, speed, and striking power. The transformation was not the result of a single breakthrough, but of persistence applied over years of war. The Corsair's story had become one of redemption, written in rivets and resolve. And now, with the fleet's confidence restored and the Pacific battle lines tightening, the stage was set for the aircraft to face its greatest test, a confrontation where engineering, skill, and endurance would collide with an enemy fighting its final, desperate battles. June 1944 brought the Pacific War to a crossroads. The American push through the Central Pacific had gathered momentum, and the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, stood as the next step toward Japan itself. For the Empire, their defense was essential. For the United States, their capture would place bomber bases within reach of the Japanese homeland. In the waters surrounding these islands, the largest carrier forces either nation had ever assembled prepared for a confrontation neither could afford to lose. The stage was set for a battle that would redefine the meaning of air superiority in the Pacific. Japan entered the campaign with determination but dwindling strength. Their carrier air groups, once composed of veterans forged in the early victories of 1941 and 1942, now included large numbers of inexperienced pilots trained in shortened programs designed to fill the gaps left by attrition. Yet Tokyo committed fully to what would become the last major carrier offensive of the war. Hundreds of aircraft were loaded onto decks, Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, each one carrying the hopes of an empire fighting against time. When the orders came, more than 400 aircraft rose into the morning light, wings flashing as they formed into attack groups bound for the American fleet. Far ahead of them, American radar stations, powerful, disciplined, and fully integrated into fleet operations, tracked the approaching waves. The operators watched the screens fill with echoes, each blip a symbol of the battle rushing toward them. No longer would American forces be surprised as they had been at Coral Sea or Midway. Every mile of sky between the islands and the carriers became a monitored corridor, watched by ships and picket destroyers whose antennas swept the horizon with silent precision. The defenders knew exactly what was coming. Corsairs and Hellcats were scrambled in disciplined rotations, their engines sending tremors across steel decks as they launched into open sky. The pilots climbed quickly, forming layered screens designed to intercept the Japanese formations long before they could reach the task force. Many of the aviators had trained intensively for this moment, their skills sharpened by months of combat and a logistical system that ensured plentiful flight hours. They flew machines that were heavier than the Zero, more powerful, better armored, and armed with 650 caliber guns capable of tearing through aluminum with brutal efficiency. The clash began miles from the American fleet. Japanese bombers, flying in tight formations, pushed forward with determination, but the defenders met them with speed and altitude. The Corsairs dove first, their gull wings cutting through the air in steep intercepts that scattered the incoming groups. Behind them, Hellcats pounced on stragglers, firing controlled bursts into aircraft that struggled to evade with the agility that had once defined Japanese air combat. The torpedo planes, slower, vulnerable, and reliant on long straight runs to deliver their weapons, were the first to fall. Many never came within sight of the American carriers. Above this chaos, the Zeros attempted to provide cover, but even their most skilled pilots found themselves outmatched. They faced opponents who could dive faster, climb harder, and absorb damage that once would have destroyed an American fighter. The Corsairs struck from above in disciplined attacks, using the very tactics forged months earlier over Bougainville and Rabaul. The vertical battlefield that favored American aircraft reduced the once feared Zero to a relic of an earlier era. Veteran Japanese aces, men who had survived dozens of engagements, were cut down in moments by aircraft whose power and protection turned the tide of every encounter. For the American pilots, the battle unfolded with a grim clarity. They described the sky as a shifting landscape of arcs and smoke trails, punctuated by the brief flashes of burning fuel. Many saw enemy planes only as silhouettes that disintegrated moments later. The engagement became so one-sided that pilots returning to their carriers struggled to reconcile the scale of destruction they had witnessed. What they experienced came to be known by a name both crude and unforgettable: the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase that captured the imbalance of a battle shaped by radar, training, and the technological gulf that now separated the two air forces. On Japanese carriers, the mood changed from determination to disbelief. Commanders watched as aircraft that had left their decks in confident waves failed to return. Flight crews stood by with signaling flags and wheel chocks, waiting for squadrons that had effectively ceased to exist. Hours passed, and only a handful of planes limped back to their ships. Some landed riddled with holes. Others crashed into the sea, their fuel spent long before they found a home deck. The scale of the loss became clear as air wings dwindled to single digits. Japan had launched its largest carrier strike of the war, and lost nearly all of it in a day. By nightfall, the great air arm that had carried Japan to early victories in the Pacific had been reduced to fragments. The loss of pilots, many irreplaceable veterans, was a blow from which the empire could not recover. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese dominance, had been outflown, outgunned, and outlasted. And among the machines that achieved that reversal stood the Corsair, its presence now unmistakable in the shifting balance of the war. Yet even after the Marianas, the Corsair's journey was not finished. Ahead lay the battles that would take it into the closing chapters of the conflict, where desperation, innovation, and sacrifice converged in the final struggle for the Pacific sky. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final and most punishing phase. Okinawa, a rugged island chain just 350 miles from Japan, became the last great battlefield before the homeland itself. For the United States, its capture was essential. For Japan, its defense was a final act of defiance. And into these waters sailed the largest invasion fleet ever assembled in the Pacific. A gathering of ships so vast that sailors said the horizon looked forged from steel. The Japanese High Command had no illusions about meeting such force in open battle. Instead, they turned to a weapon that required neither fuel reserves nor strategic advantage, only resolve. They called it Toko. The world would come to know it as the kamikaze. When the first waves appeared over Okinawa, they came not as formations, but as solitary points of light on radar, each one a single aircraft flown by a pilot who did not intend to return. Some carried bombs, others carried only their fuel. All carried a mission to crash into American ships with the force of a human-guided missile. The tactic was as desperate as it was brutal. For the sailors watching the sky, it became a daily reckoning with fire. Against this new threat, the Corsair was thrust into a role no one had imagined when its designers first sketched its bent wings on drafting paper. Now it launched from carriers and island strips in continuous cycles, engines roaring across decks streaked with the scars of months-long operations. Pilots climbed quickly into the humid air above Okinawa, scanning for the faint glint of a canopy or the smoke of an engine pushed to its limits. The enemy no longer maneuvered to fight. They maneuvered to die. The encounters that followed were among the most intense of the entire war. Interception demanded proximity, sometimes so close that pilots felt the heat from engines aflame even before their guns finished firing. Corsair aviators described these moments with a restraint born not from detachment, but from the difficulty of putting such battles into words. They spoke of flame diving towards steel decks, of aircraft that seemed to fall apart even as they held their deadly trajectory, of the split second in which a pilot had to choose whether to fire, evade, or ram if all else failed. At times, the sky above Okinawa felt like a furnace where speed, steel, and human intention collided in the space of a heartbeat. The Corsair's firepower became its defining virtue. 650 caliber guns, aimed with discipline and steadied by the aircraft's weight, could tear through a kamikaze before it ever reached its descent path. Again and again, Corsair squadrons intercepted attackers miles from the fleet, breaking apart wooden frames that disintegrated in orange blossoms of flame. For every aircraft that slipped through, 3 more were destroyed before they could begin their dives. The tally was not merely statistics. Each interception represented a ship saved, a crew spared, a line of white wakes uninterrupted across the sea. Still, the threat was relentless. Kamikazes came at dawn, at dusk, and in the uncertain hours between. Some dove from clouds, others skimmed the waves, using the glare of sunlit water as a shield. The Corsairs were forced to adapt each day, learning the patterns of attack, the angles of approach, the deceptive stillness that often preceded a sudden dive. Pilots returned to their carriers with gun barrels glowing, their planes streaked with smoke and salt, and once they landed, they knew the cycle would begin again. There was no pause in the defense of Okinawa, only rotation, refuel, and return. Beneath this struggle lay a deeper truth about the state of the Japanese air arm. The Zero, once celebrated as a marvel of agility and range, had become a vessel for a tactic born of necessity. Its light frame, once an asset in dogfights, now carried explosives instead of ammunition. Its pilots, once selected for skill, now included students with only a handful of flight hours. The aircraft that had dominated the early years of the war no longer met its enemies as equals. It met them as the final expression of an empire fighting with its last, most tragic resource. For the Corsair, the confrontation became symbolic as well as tactical. Here, in the dying months of the conflict, the warplane that had once been mocked for its weight, its awkward stance, its perceived flaws, now stood between the fleet and destruction. Its power, its durability, and its fire became the shield that allowed the American advance to continue. On the decks of carriers anchored off Okinawa, crews understood this intimately. Every ship saved was a testament to the pilots who met fire with fire, and to the machine that carried them into the heart of danger. By the end of the campaign, the skies over Okinawa bore the marks of countless duels, each one a moment in the struggle that defined the war's closing chapter. And in those skies, the Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, met its executioner not through hatred, but through the irrevocable tide of a war it could no longer shape. Ahead lay the final approach to Japan itself, a horizon marked by uncertainty, devastation, and decisions that would determine the course of history. By 1945, the empire that had once reshaped the Pacific sky now found itself unable to sustain the very war it had begun. Japan's industrial base, fragile even in the best of years, collapsed under the weight of bombardment, blockade, and scarcity. Fuel that once flowed to frontline units was rationed to a trickle. Factories that had produced engines, airframes, and spare parts now stood silent, their roofs torn open by firebombs, their workers displaced or lost to the growing desperation at home. The aviation industry that had birthed the Zero was reduced to assembling what scraps remained, a shadow of the precision that had once defined it. In this new reality, the pilots who rose to defend the homeland bore almost none of the training that had shaped their predecessors. The aces of China, Pearl Harbor, and Guadalcanal were gone, lost in years of attrition that Japan could not hope to reverse. In their place stood boys barely old enough to shave, sent aloft in aircraft built with unpainted metal, wooden components, and engines that coughed more than they roared. Many received only hours of instruction, learning to take off but rarely to land, because landing was no longer part of the mission. In the final months of the war, Japan's skies held not the seasoned warriors who once mastered the Zero, but young men asked to fill an impossible void. The Zero itself, once the symbol of Japanese ascendancy, suffered alongside its pilots. Designs that had been revolutionary in 1940 were hopelessly outdated by 1945. Lighter construction, once its strength, now made it defenseless against the heavy guns of American fighters. Attempts to improve the airframe failed as Japan struggled to build competitive engines. Prototypes never reached reliable production. The Zero that rose into the late war sky was largely the same machine that had stunned the world years earlier, but war had moved beyond it. Against Corsairs, Hellcats, and Mustangs, it became what it had never been before: prey. American pilots who intercepted these late war formations described scenes that lacked the drama of earlier battles. Approaching Zeros often flew in loose, disordered groups, their movements betraying inexperience and fear. In some cases, engines sputtered or seized before contact was even made, sending aircraft spiraling into the sea without a single shot fired. The engagements took seconds, short bursts of .50 caliber fire from Corsairs tearing fragile wings apart, sending aircraft tumbling downward in disintegrating arcs. Victory no longer carried the thrill of survival. It carried the weight of inevitability. And with inevitability came something few had expected: pity. Corsair pilots who had once studied the Zero with respect now watched young opponents struggle simply to hold formation. Rarely did they see the tight turns and sudden dives that had defined their early encounters. Instead, they watched courage unaccompanied by capability. Some American aviators returned to their carriers shaken, describing the sight of boys diving in outdated machines as a tragedy repeating itself in the clouds. War had stripped both sides of illusions, and what remained was a stark understanding of sacrifice consumed without purpose. Across the Pacific, Japan's airfields reflected the broader collapse. Runways cracked under the stress of repeated bombings. Hangars lay in ruins, their rafters twisted into silhouettes that flickered in the rising sun. What few aircraft remained were dispersed into wooded areas, hidden under camouflage netting. Engines warmed only when fuel became available, which was rarely. The empire that had once celebrated the harmony of man and machine now faced a reality in which neither was sufficient. Factories, once so proud of their craftsmanship, stood silent, their assembly lines halted in positions that looked frozen mid-breath. Pride, once the engine of innovation, had become the weight that kept Japan from adapting to a rapidly changing war. Meanwhile, the Corsair moved through the Pacific, with a confidence earned through years of refinement and struggle. It patrolled the skies with an engine whose reliability matched its power, guided by pilots who had survived the brutal learning curve of the early war. Over Okinawa, over the Philippines, and finally over Japan itself, it flew not as an experiment or a gamble, but as a mature instrument of American air superiority. In these final months, it ruled the sky not through excess, but through experience, the culmination of every lesson learned since its troubled beginnings. And so, in the closing acts of the Pacific War, the story that had begun with mockery reached its final, solemn note. The Zero, once spoken of with awe, now vanished into the sea in silence. The Corsair, once dismissed as clumsy, now circled above empty skies where no challengers remained. What began in laughter ended in quiet, a quiet shaped by loss, by endurance, and by the relentless forward motion of a war that allowed no machine, no doctrine, and no belief to remain unchanged. By August 1945, the Pacific had fallen quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The smoke that had long clung to its horizons thinned at last, revealing waters once hidden beneath the shadows of fleets and fire. News of Japan's surrender rippled outward from war rooms and radio towers, carried across islands that had been fought over inch by inch, and on the airstrips where Corsairs had launched into some of the war's fiercest skies, the engines that had once shaken the earth now idled with a gentleness few had ever associated with them. The end had come. The long return home could begin. Corsair squadrons departed from ruined islands in small groups, lifting off from runways carved between shattered trees, cratered fields, and rusting wreckage that glinted beneath the sun. The pilots guiding them were young, many barely 20, though their faces carried the gravity of men far older. They had flown through storms of steel at Okinawa, had chased diving Zeros above Rabaul, had watched the ocean rise toward them through gunfire and burning fuel. Now they climbed through a sky that no longer fought them. Each mile eastward carried them closer to home, yet further from a world that only those who had lived it could fully understand. On the ground, crews prepared the final tasks of a war that had defined their lives. They washed soot from engine cowlings scorched by months of combat. They patched bullet holes out of habit, even though no enemy would fire again. They checked fuel lines and hydraulic systems as if the next sortie still mattered. These men had tended the Corsair through its darkest days, from the tests that nearly ended its career to the battles that revealed its strength. Now they handled the aircraft with a tenderness born not of routine, but of farewell. As the Corsairs gathered on their last island stopovers, lined wingtip to wingtip on runways that bore the scars of the entire war, the scale of their journey became impossible to ignore. The fighter had appeared first above the Solomons, awkward and mistrusted. It had carved its reputation above Bougainville, had proven itself at Rabaul, and had become indispensable during the Marianas. It had weathered the turning of the tide, the collapse of the Zero, and the firestorms over Okinawa. In the end, the Corsair had flown over every major battle across the Pacific, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a testament to what persistence could achieve when time and necessity demanded transformation. For every flaw it carried into the war, the talking engine, the brutal landings, the long nose that obscured the deck, it repaid the men who mastered it in survival and victory. It saved pilots who trusted its climbs. It delivered strikes that altered the course of battles. It endured punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Its story was not one of inherent brilliance, but of realized potential, a promise fulfilled only through struggle. The pilots who stepped down from its wings at war's end often touched the fuselage one last time, not out of sentimentality, but out of recognition. They knew what the aircraft had demanded from them: calm under pressure, discipline under fear, certainty in moments when a heartbeat could mean the difference between life and the long sea below. In return, it had given them the ability to fight an enemy that once seemed untouchable. They had grown with it, suffered with it, and survived because of it. When the final squadron shut down its engines, the sound carried across the airfield like a long exhale. The blades slowed, the exhaust faded, and the vibrations that had defined the war's rhythm eased into stillness. For a moment, all that remained was the heat rising from cooling metal and the distant echo of a conflict that had reshaped the world. The Corsair's journey, from rejected prototype to Pacific champion, ended not with celebration, but with quiet. A quiet earned through endurance, sacrifice, and the long arc of a war that had tested every man and machine it touched. And in that quiet, history breathed again, ready for the final chapter that waited just beyond the horizon. In the years after the Second World War, the world's attention shifted from the deserts of North Africa and the forests of Europe to a new landscape of geopolitics. Yet even as nations rebuilt, the Corsair did not retire with the war that had shaped it. Instead, it found itself once again called into service, this time over the frozen mountains and river valleys of Korea. There, amid the bitter winds and the roar of jet engines that signaled aviation's next frontier, the old propeller-driven fighter proved it still had a role to play. Pilots who had grown up studying the battles of the Pacific now climbed into aircraft their father's generation had first tested in crisis, and in close air support missions, launched from small, crowded carriers, the Corsair demonstrated a truth that surprised no one who had ever flown it. Raw power and rugged design did not age quickly. While jets dominated the high altitudes, the Corsair found purpose down low, where speed mattered less than precision and durability. It strafed supply lines, broke armored columns, and delivered rockets with a steadiness few early jets could match. Marines spoke of its resilience, how it absorbed small arms fire, and returned home bearing scars that testified to the intensity of the new conflict. The aircraft that had once been criticized for its weight and bulk now used those very qualities to serve in a war defined by ground support rather than aerial duels. Korea revealed what the Pacific had hinted. The Corsair was not merely a fighter, it was a tool of endurance. Its influence extended far beyond the battlefield. Post-war engineers, many of whom had worked on the Corsair as young draftsmen or line technicians, carried its lessons into the dawn of the jet age. They remembered how carrier landings demanded balance between lift and visibility, how torque could dictate the very shape of wings and stabilizers, how a machine could be both powerful and unforgiving. These insights shaped the next generation of naval aircraft, informing everything from swept-wing designs to reinforced landing gear capable of absorbing the impact of faster, heavier machines. The Corsair's legacy was not preserved only in museums. It was embedded in blueprints, calculations, and the quiet decisions that defined new aircraft across the 1950s and beyond. Carrier aviation itself evolved under the Corsair's influence. The curved landing approach pioneered by marine pilots in the Solomons became standard practice across the fleet. Deck crews refined procedures to manage high-performance aircraft with demanding visibility profiles. Even the philosophy of power-to-weight ratios, once a gamble in the Corsair's development, became a cornerstone of American design. In ways both visible and subtle, the aircraft that had once struggled to earn a place on carrier decks ended up shaping how future generations returned to them. Meanwhile, the Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, faded into history with a quiet dignity. In Japan, surviving airframes were restored and placed in museums, their thin wings and delicate structures preserved as reminders of a different era of warfare. Veterans, both American and Japanese, visited these exhibits in later years, sometimes standing in silence before the machines that had defined their youth. The Zero became a relic studied for its innovation and its limitations, a symbol of early war brilliance undone by the rapid evolution of global conflict. The Corsair, by contrast, continued to fly for decades, transitioning from frontline service to reserve units, then to civilian hands where it raced, performed, and lived on as a testament to the durability of its design. From these two intertwined stories emerged a moral that engineers, historians, and pilots understood instinctively: underestimate nothing. The Corsair had been ridiculed for its appearance, doubted for its handling, dismissed by those who judged only what they could see. Yet it had outlasted the skeptics, the war that shaped it, and even some of the technologies meant to replace it. Its bent wings, once symbols of awkward experimentation, came to represent dominance earned through difficulty, innovation drawn from necessity, and transformation forged in the fires of war. And behind that transformation lay a truth older than aviation itself. Progress is often born from failure. No aircraft begins perfect. No design reaches maturity without risk. The Corsair's triumph lay not in its early performance, but in the hands of the men who refused to abandon it, and the engineers who refused to accept its limitations as final. Doubt, in this story, was not the enemy of invention. It was its cradle. In the end, the Corsair's legacy stretched far beyond the Pacific, beyond the carriers that once trembled under its landings, beyond the conflicts where its wings carved their mark. It lived on in every aircraft that sought power without sacrificing control, in every blueprint that balanced ambition with humility, in every lesson drawn from a machine that proved its worth only when pushed to the edge. And thus, the bent-wing beast, born in mockery, ascended into history as a symbol of what determination can create, and what doubt, wisely faced, can ultimately become. The Corsair's story, when viewed from the calm distance of history, settles into a shape defined by irony. It began not as a legend, but as a problem, a machine laughed at on test ranges, cursed on carrier decks, and doubted by the very men asked to fly it. Its bent wings were mocked, its engine maligned, its future uncertain. Yet from these early stumbles emerged a transformation few could have predicted. The rejected fighter became the one that reshaped the balance of the Pacific sky. It is a reminder that in war, as in invention, first impressions rarely survive contact with reality. That reality was shaped just as powerfully by the adversary. Japan entered the war with an aircraft that embodied its doctrine, elegant, precise, and seemingly invincible. The Zero upheld the belief that agility and pilot skill could compensate for industrial limitations. For a time, this belief held true, but overconfidence has a way of burying its own warnings. As Japan's early victories accumulated, so too did a quiet rigidity, an unwillingness to question assumptions, to revise doctrine, or to challenge the spiritual certainty that the Zero's perfection required no successor. Against that backdrop, America's relentless adaptation became something more than a technical response. It became a philosophical one. The battles that followed revealed the consequences of two opposing mindsets. The war in the sky was not won solely by horsepower or altitude. It was won through humility and endurance, by the side willing to question itself and learn at speed. For every American engineer who despaired at the Corsair's failures, another refused to surrender to them. For every pilot who returned from a bruising carrier test, ready to condemn the aircraft, another stepped forward, determined to find a solution. Slowly, painfully, through torn landing gear and broken propellers, and nights spent rewriting calculations, the Corsair grew into its promise. Its victories were not the triumphs of a perfect design, but of persistence applied until imperfection became strength. In those final years of the war, the lessons deepened. Japan's aviation program, starved of resources and bound to doctrine, found itself unable to evolve. Power without understanding, without the infrastructure or willingness to adapt, became ruin. Yet on the other side of the ocean, failure without surrender created mastery. The Corsair proved this every time it rose above the limits that once defined it, every time its pilots trusted it to pull them through the vertical fight, every time its designers chased one more improvement rather than cling to what had already been built. It is tempting to speak of the Zero as a fallen titan and the Corsair as its executioner. But the deeper truth is more nuanced. The Zero was perfect in its way, a machine optimized for a moment in history. The Corsair, by contrast, was alive, a machine capable of change, shaped by the hands that built it and the men who flew it. Where the Zero embodied mastery achieved, the Corsair embodied mastery pursued. And in a war that demanded constant reinvention, the latter proved the more enduring strength. By the time the guns fell silent, the shape once ridiculed on American airstrips had come to symbolize something profound. The bent wings that drew laughter became the silhouette of a fighter that ruled the Pacific skies, not because it was flawless, but because it never stopped becoming better. Its journey traced the arc of the war itself, uncertainty giving way to resolve, failure turning into learning, and mockery ending in respect. In the Corsair's rise, the war offered its final lesson. True strength is not found in the machines that begin as masterpieces, but in the ones that learn, stumble, and rise until they earn their place in the sky. They mocked its shape once, then it ruled the Pacific skies.